As difficult as it might be to process, some of the worst things that have happened to humans were caused at the hands of other humans themselves. Even worse is when the victims are unwitting and vulnerable, whether being children, the elderly, or the mentally ill. Human experimentation in various forms dates back as far as humankind itself, whether on a professional level or not. There have been countless human experimentations conducted with willing participants and honest researchers. Most of these were relatively safe and many had very positive outcomes, but there have also been many experiments conducted by researchers that were obsessed with nothing but results. Whether researching for medical, psychological, or sociological purposes, sometimes it is forgotten that the test subjects are fellow human beings, if that point is even considered to begin with. Here's 15 human experiments that have left a dark stain on human history. Let's begin. Number 1. This first case on the list dates back almost 200 years. Alexis St Martin was an employee of the American fur company Mackinac Island. On June 6, 1822, he was accidentally shot at close range, injuring his ribs and stomach. Although he survived, the way the wound healed left a hole in his stomach. The hole ended up attached to a hole in his skin. He was treated by the American Army physician William Beaumont. Observing how the wound healed, Dr. Beaumont realized he had a unique opportunity to observe the digestive process in humans, which at the time was not well understood. Dr. Beaumont would place food in Alexis Martin's stomach. The food was attached to a string and would later be pulled out of the stomach in order to be observed. Dr. Beaumont conducted roughly 200 of these experiments between 1822 and 1833. Although Alexis agreed to these experiments, they caused a lot of discomfort and pain. After the experiments, Dr. Beaumont published these findings. He was praised for his discoveries as they were revolutionary at the time. Number 2. Project Artichoke was a project that the CIA created as a way to get mental control over someone in order to get the individual to do anything they want. The project studied hypnosis, forced morphine addiction and withdrawal, and the use of LSD to produce amnesia in vulnerable individuals. The CIA carried out these experiments both in-house and overseas. They used LSD hypnosis and total isolation as forms of mental harassment for specialized interrogations. The subjects would experience amnesia and only have a vague recollection of the experiments. The project was eventually shut down in the mid-1960s, but it opened the door to the CIA conducting more mind control experiments. Number 3. In 1939, 22 children from a veterans orphanage were selected for an experiment. Wendell Johnson created the experiment, and under his supervision, Mary Tudor conducted it at the University of Iowa. The children were under the impression that they would be receiving speech therapy, and none of them knew the true intent of the experiment. The purpose of the experiment was to see if stuttering could be induced in children that otherwise were fluent. Half of the children were praised for their fluency and received positive speech therapy. However, the other half of the children received negative feedback and were belittled for their speech. The impact this had on the children was so profound that many of them developed stutters or speech impediments, some that lasted the rest of their lives. Johnson did not seek publication of the test results as he feared harsh criticism, but the results were available in the library of the University of Iowa. These experiments didn't become national news until 2001, when a series of articles were written by an investigative reporter at the San Jose Mercury News. The experiments were harshly criticized by both the public and professionals alike. On August 17, 2007, 6 of the orphan children were awarded a total of $925,000 by the state of Iowa for the lifelong psychological issues that they suffered due to the torment they experienced for 6 months during the experiments. Number 4. During the apartheid era in South Africa, there was a dual policy when it came to homosexuals in the military. This policy prohibited permanent members of the South African military from being homosexual, while permitting homosexuality among those who were drafted. This policy was made as the government was worried that young men being drafted into the military would claim they were homosexuals in order to avoid serving. Although the military claimed to tolerate homosexuality, Those who identified this way were forced into therapy between 1971 and 1989. The therapy consisted of compulsive shock therapy, castration, and other procedures that violated human rights. The victims were shown black and white photos of naked men and told they should fantasize about the men. They would then be given a powerful shock of electricity. They were then shown color photos of naked women hoping to arouse the men. This attempt failed, and it was clear that sexual realignment procedures did not work. When these experiments were deemed a failure, they forced the men into sex change operations. 900 homosexuals aged 16 to 24 years old were surgically turned into women and given new birth certificates. The surgeries were done in military hospitals, and a very high rate of the men died during the operations. Many of the operations were only halfway completed, leaving the men mutilated. In 1995, the Medical Association of South Africa issued a public apology for the wrongdoings of the past. Number 5. Dr. Leo Stanley was a chief surgeon at San Quentin State Prison from 1913 to 1951. Stanley believed that criminal activity was a disease caused by inferior genetics. He believed in sterilizing criminals so that they couldn't pass their genes down to their offspring. Although involuntary sterilization was illegal at the time in California, Stanley was usually able to get inmates to trust him enough to agree to the procedure voluntarily. Stanley conducted his own research and began experiments with inmates that he talked into consenting to the procedures. He began removing the testicles from inmates that were executed and would transplant them into older inmates, removing their original testicles beforehand. When Stanley ended up with more inmates needing this procedure than inmates on death row, he came up with another solution. Stanley began injecting glands from goats into inmates. Over the course of 22 years, Stanley carried out over 10,000 procedures, all with consenting inmates. Despite nothing too often coming from these procedures, Stanley still experimented on humans in a way that changed them for the rest of their lives. Number 6. Bruce Ramar was born August 22, 1965, in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Ramar was one of 2 twin boys, and at 7 months old, the boys had a circumcision done as doctors were concerned about the way they urinated. A urologist performed the procedure in an unorthodox way by using cauterization. The procedure didn't go as planned, and Ramar's genitals were burned beyond surgical repair. His parents were concerned with his ability to have a happy life from that point on, and brought him to see John Money, a psychologist that specialized in gender identity. Money told the parents that Ramar's penis couldn't be repaired, but that it would be easy to replicate a vagina. He also stated that gender identity was a learned trait and not something that happened biologically. Money also saw this as an opportunity to conduct an experiment by monitoring both boys and see the differences between the one being raised as a boy and the one being raised as a girl. Ramar underwent a surgery removing all of his male parts and being fashioned into female parts. His gender was reassigned and he was given the name Brenda. All throughout Ramar's childhood, Money continued to experiment on him and his brother, often in very questionable ways. Ramar was also given estrogen, which helped him develop breasts when he got older. By the time he was 13 years old, he had developed suicidal depression and told his parents he would end his life if he had to see Money ever again. Following the advice of his psychiatrist, Ramar's parents finally told him the truth about his gender. After finding this out, Ramar decided to assume a male identity and changed his name to David. By 1987, he underwent multiple surgeries to remove his breast and had 2 surgeries to reconstruct his penis, along with starting testosterone treatment. Things began going well for Ramar later in life. He ended up getting married, but things eventually took a very dark turn. Ramar had a strained relationship with his parents, and he also had to deal with unemployment, as well as the death of his twin brother who overdosed on antidepressants on July 1, 2002. Ramar's wife separated from him on May 2, 2004. 2 days later, the morning of May 4, 2004, he drove to the parking lot of a grocery store and ended his life by a self-inflicted gunshot. Ramar's legacy has lived on and has played a large role in how children's gender identity issues have been handled ever since. Number 7. Between 1963 and 1973, experiments were conducted on many inmates from Washington and Oregon prisons. The experiments were conducted by the University of Washington on behalf of the U.S. government. The prisoners were bribed with cash and the possibility of parole, and were also told that the experiments would be safe. 130 inmates willingly participated in the experiments. The subjects were zapped with over 400 rads of radiation, which is the equivalent of 2,400 X-rays in 10-minute intervals. Later on in life, the inmates found out just how dangerous the experiments were. In year 2000, the former participants settled a $2.4 million class action lawsuit against the University of Washington. Number 8. From August 14th to August 20th, 1971, the Stanford prison experiment was a social psychology demonstration to better understand the conflict between prison inmates and guards. Offered money to participate, 24 male students from Stanford University participated. Between the 24 students, half were selected to be inmates, and the other half were selected to be guards. The simulation was originally planned to be 2 weeks long. The inmates were brought to Stanford Psychology Building. They were blindfolded in order to not know where they were and to give the prison a more authentic feel. The prisoners were put into 6x9 cells with only a cot in them. Things escalated rather quickly between the guards and the inmates, with some of the inmates barricading their cell doors. Both parties involved in the experiment seemed to quickly forget this was a mock setting and began taking on their roles more seriously than expected. Some of the inmates were subjected to psychological and physical abuse, many of which accepted it from the guards. Other inmates broke down mentally to the point that they had to be excused from the experiment. After only 4 days, the experiment was shut down after those involved realized how dangerous it was becoming. Many other professionals heavily criticized those who were involved in planning and executing such a reckless and dangerous experiment on university students. Number 9. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted the Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in black males. The study started in 1932 when the U.S. Public Health Service worked with Tuskegee University, a predominantly black college in Alabama. 600 impoverished African American sharecroppers were recruited for the study. They were offered free health care, meals, and burial insurance. Out of these men, 399 of them had previously contracted syphilis, whereas the other 201 had not. The men were told that the study would only last 6 months, but it ended up lasting 40 years. The men were never told they had syphilis, and when funding for the experiment went away, the men were no longer being treated for their medical condition. Even when penicillin was proven to be an effective cure for syphilis in 1947, the experiments continued anyway. The study continued until 1972 when it was made public. It was harshly criticized for being cruel and unethical. Not only did the men have syphilis, but they gave it to many of their wives, and even some of their children were born with it. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized for the study, calling it the most infamous biomedical experiment in U.S. history. Number 10. In 1961, Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University, began a series of social psychology experiments. The experiments were used to test a person's ability to follow commands from an authority figure. 2 individuals would be chosen for the experiments. One would be a real test subject, and the other was an actor. The test subjects were never aware the other person was an actor. The 2 individuals would be placed into separate rooms where they could hear each other but not see each other. The test subject would ask the doctor a series of questions. Every time the actor got a question wrong, the test subject would be instructed to give them a large, painful shock of electricity from a device that was set up. Although the test subject eventually decided they no longer wanted to shock the actor, they would continue to do so anyway and follow directions, being told that they wouldn't get into trouble and that the individual being shocked wouldn't sustain any permanent harm. Number 11. Many defectors of North Korea have described the various horrible experiments they have witnessed being conducted. In one experiment, 50 healthy female prison inmates were given poisoned cabbage leaves. All 50 of the women were dead within the next 20 minutes. Other claims have been made about individuals being beaten until they were in a zombie-like state and then being used for target practice. Others have said there were surgeries performed on victims without anesthesia. Once per month, a black fan known as the Crow comes to the prison to collect 40 to 50 inmates. They're then brought to an unknown location where unknown experiments are conducted on them. Number 12. From 1937 to 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army conducted a series of experiments on unwilling participants. The covert research experiments were labeled as Unit 731. Based in the city of Harmon, Unit 731 was responsible for some of the worst war crimes ever committed. Chinese and Russian subjects were chosen. Men, women, children, infants, and the elderly and even pregnant women were subjected to these experiments. The experiments included surgeries performed on live victims, amputations of limbs to study blood loss, germ warfare attacks, and weapons testing. However, despite committing these horrible war crimes, many of these scientists involved in Unit 731 rose to prominent careers in politics, business, and medicine. Number 13. Shortly after World War II, the impending Cold War was on the minds of many Americans. Many medical researchers were trying to find ways to better understand radioactivity and chemical warfare. At Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, 829 pregnant women were given what they thought were vitamin drinks that would help their unborn babies become healthier. In reality, the drinks contained radioactive iron. The researchers wanted to study how quickly the radioisotopes would cross into the placenta. It's known that at least 7 of the babies exposed to this died from leukemia and other forms of cancer. Many of the mothers also suffered from rashes, bruises, anemia, loss of hair and teeth, and even cancer. Number 14. In 1943, the US Navy wanted to test new clothing and masks to see how effective they were against mustard gas, which had proven to be horrifying and deadly in the First World War. The subjects in the experiment were 17 and 18 years old and were approached for the experiment shortly after completing their 8 weeks of boot camp. It wasn't until the boys reached the research laboratory that they were informed that the test included the use of mustard gas. The test proved that the new gear wasn't very effective against mustard gas, and nearly all of the participants received severe internal and external burns. After the experiments concluded, the participants were ignored by the Navy and even threatened with the Espionage Act of times. It wasn't until 1991 that the reports were declassified and were taken before Congress. Number 15. In 1950, the US Navy wanted to experiment with what a large-scale biological attack would be like. The Navy sprayed large amounts of the bacteria Serratia over the city of San Francisco in what was called Operation Sea Spray. At the time, the bacteria was thought to be harmless, but they soon found out that it wasn't. Numerous citizens in the area ended up with pneumonia-like symptoms, and the bacteria even caused one person to die. The family of the deceased citizen later sued the government for gross negligence, but a federal judge ruled in favor of the government in 1981. Tests using Serratia were continued until 1969. That concludes our list of some of the most dark and disturbing human experiments that have ever happened in the history of time. While I'm sure not all of these experiments had a bad intent behind them, that doesn't change the fact that what these people went through is absolutely horrifying and cruel. Experimentation can be a good thing, but it can also lead to some unfortunate darkness. Be safe out there and don't agree to be any kind of lab rat without knowing the full details. You never know. You too could end up on one of these videos someday, so be careful. Now, before I close the video out for good, I would just like to ask that if any of you have a personal scary story, please submit it to me at my email at southerncannibal@gmail.com. I really want your stories, so please send them my way. And one more thing. I want to shout out all of my patrons on Patreon before we bring this to an official close. So to all of my $5 patrons that are also featured on screen, along with my $3 patrons on screen, shout out to Ulisa, Babe Lincoln, Beth A, Kate E, Carrie B, Celeste S, Courtney T, Ellie S, Howard R, Jacqueline W, Jazzy G, Jennifer M, Jess, Jonathan C, Catherine M, Carrie F, Matthew B, Michael G, Random Randy, Steph L, Tammy S, and Terry H. Thank all of you so much for supporting me. If you'd like to join these awesome people, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/southerncannibal. And remember to always